Everybody posting this live.
Send it to the bash.
Should I go live?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And then we can.
What's up, guys? All right. Not now. Share link. Sorry, folks who are watching. We're just getting ready to launch this. No, but I mean, this becomes part of the recording later.
Yeah.
So whether they're watching it now or later, they're watching. Yeah, you may as well.
Good, yeah.
No harm.
Here's the clicker.
What do you think of that light?
I think it's better, yeah.
Okay. Well, this is not the right place to stand because I'm blocking the screen. I think I'm blocking the screen no matter where I stand.
No, that's all.
We'll try this. No worries. All right. Did everybody get a t-shirt? If you didn't get a t-shirt, make sure you grab a t-shirt on your way out. Hopefully we got the right sizes for everybody. But, and we're just testing out our YouTube Live functionality. So if I'm staring at the laptop a lot, that's why. Oh, there's already people on the YouTube Live. I don't know how people find out that quickly. Hey. All right, thanks for coming, guys. So before we get started, we're going to try to structure this a little bit differently tonight. We've done a few of these before. We're realizing that the content that we're doing tends to be very introductory, tends to be targeting people who have never heard of the project, want to know a little bit about what we're doing, and we'll do that today. We'll give kind of high-level introduction about Aion. But I know that many of you were probably at the conference today as well, probably heard some of the initial ideas. Some of you may already be following the project on a frequent basis. So we also want to make sure that we can just set this up to be a little bit more interactive and spend some time talking about what it is that you're interested in our design and where our priorities are right now as a project. So I'll give you a little introduction about myself, but before I do that, how many of you were at the conference today? Just quick show of hands. Okay, so a little bit more than half maybe. How many of you have never been to a blockchain meetup before? First time blockchain meetup. Okay. How many of you own cryptocurrency? All right, cool. How many of you own Aion? All right, cool. There we go. Okay, so quick intros of our team who's with me here today. I don't see Roland. Where's Roland? Roland's outside somewhere. Anyways, Roland's here. He'll walk in at some point. Sam here in the front. There's Roland. You got Jared back here hiding. This is on our board of directors. And this is Jay, who's been our community manager, and you'll hear from him a little bit later as well, just about what we're doing on the community side. My name is Matt. So I'm the founder of the project. We're primarily a Toronto-based team, so we flew in from Canada a couple of days ago. We had a meetup yesterday in Cape Town. We're doing Canada. We're doing kind of a series of these now because we're kind of at the stage in the maturity of the project where we're really focused on capturing kind of the mind share of developers, getting the technical message out there of what we're building, what we think the vision of the future of this industry needs to look like, and what problems have yet to be solved for us to accomplish that vision. So while the team is kind of hard at work back home, we have this hard life of having to spend nights on airplanes and flying to terrible places like Cape Town and Johannesburg. But we've been mind blown by these cities since we've been here. So really happy to be here. So you're going to see, if you follow the project, you'll see a lot more of these. We're trying to do a lot more kind of face-to-face interaction with members of the community in different parts of the world. We're off to Nairobi on Saturday. We're doing 2 events in Nairobi, big tech hub there. And then a few weeks later, we're off to Asia, where we're doing 3 events in mainland China. We're doing an event in Korea, Tokyo, and then off to Israel. So there's a lot of kind of globe hopping happening, which is kind of the nature of these projects. And one of the interesting challenges of running these projects is you start small and then immediately people want you to be global. So it takes a lot of planning and resources, but that's why we have a great community team. CJ never stops working. I bet you he's actually planning the Chinese meetup right now. So, okay, so a little bit about me and the project. So this is, actually, before I get into that, this is kind of the results of about 2 years of effort so far as a company. So the company behind the Aion project is called Nuco, Toronto-based Canadian company. We've been doing blockchain infrastructure for about 2 years. Before that, I ran a blockchain research and development team for Deloitte for about 2 years before that, so starting back in early 2014. A lot of the early interest that brought us into the industry was, how does this technology apply to the enterprise market? What are the challenges being faced by large banks and large incumbents as decentralized networks become more prominent? What are these centralized intermediaries going to do with their business models as we talk about the promises of decentralization. So we started building kind of a product offering around that. We built this network infrastructure that could be applied among institutions, among banks and governments and healthcare organizations and insurance companies. We did a lot of work in that domain for about 3 years. And then we started realizing that, in fact, most of the work that we were doing was application focused, building business processes and redesigning these back office systems for large organizations. But the challenges that we were facing was that the infrastructure had not yet been solved. And so we're at this stage in the industry still where we're kind of talking about how you build Netflix on 1993 internet technology. And there's just this massive separation and gap between the requirements of these applications and the reality of the infrastructure. So the more we went through these projects, the more we realized that there was some fundamental pieces missing. And what that meant to us was scale. It meant connecting multiple blockchains into a single cohesive ecosystem. But really the long-term vision of what we're all talking about is how do you build the decentralized version of the internet? And I think what we've learned over the course of the last 20 or 30 years is that although the internet started on this great promise of decentralized communication, over time it became more and more centralized, whereby we all likely interact with the internet through probably one of 10 providers. The Googles and Amazons of the world, the Baidus in China, et cetera. So we've created this massive centralized pool in this, what was intended to be this decentralized communication protocol. So what can we do differently when we have kind of a second opportunity to redesign internet protocols such that they remain decentralized and that people are incentivized to participate in that decentralized infrastructure? Because if you don't have a business model around hosting internet infrastructure, then how do you make sure that people are staying involved? And that's kind of what was the real big promise around Bitcoin when it first launched, was economic incentives behind these systems. So when we looked at the state of the industry, we realized, for one, we were building dozens and dozens of blockchains for clients. And we knew that we were doing that, and we just assumed that other people were doing that. We knew, in fact, that other companies were also building dozens and dozens of blockchains for clients, many that were custom built, many that were Ethereum style, many that were Bitcoin style, many that were Corda, like R3 blockchains. So all these fragmented designs and different DNAs of blockchains or distributed ledgers, none of which were talking to each other. So instead of building Internet 3.0, we were building fragmented networks that could not communicate with each other without centralized institutions to sit between them. And we see this in the crypto markets through things like exchanges, right? Where all of your decentralized ethos disappears the moment you need Coinbase to make a transaction happen, right? So, and that's kind of the irony of our industry, is we've rebuilt these massive centralized intermediaries to govern decentralized technologies. So we're trying to move back towards kind of the intent of this technology to keep decentralization at the core of the design, to make sure that users are in control not only of their data, but of their value and all these other things. And now we're starting to ask the fundamental questions of what needs to be built in infrastructure to keep that possible. So with that in mind, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about kind of our view of the industry today. I'm going to skip quickly through kind of an introduction of how Aion works, what it is. Sam's going to join me, throughout the presentation. We're going to talk a little bit more about like deeper points in our roadmap, what we're building, what's currently built, what's coming on the roadmap, some of the tools that are currently under development, and what we're doing on the community side. And on the community side, we're primarily focused on getting more interest out of folks like yourselves, but also getting more developers building stuff inside of our protocol or on top of our protocol. So getting more contributions from the open source community to help us get this going. So if you look at the state of the industry today, we tend to see infrastructures fall into one of these three buckets primarily. And that you'll find a lot of private enterprise solutions. You've probably heard of consortiums like R3, organizations like the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance that we're still involved in. Hyperledger, the big Linux Foundation and IBM project. So lots of opportunities and kind of interesting use cases getting developed here. You've got public systems on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, where none of these enterprises want to touch Bitcoin or Ethereum for the most part. And then you've got increasingly systems of interoperability. But really, you're looking at three fragmented types of infrastructures that haven't been natively designed to coexist, so to speak. And what we're finding really ironic is everybody's talking about kind of Internet 3.0 or Web 3, as some people call it. And we're realizing that people are building these massive stacks of technologies, from the underlying protocols to the identity mechanisms to the value transfer protocols, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But they're doing that over and over again in different silos. So somebody's building that on top of Ethereum, and somebody's rebuilding that on top of Bitcoin, and somebody's building that on top of Quantum. And none of these protocols can talk to each other. So you've got great applications or protocols getting built like Uport, which is a really, really cool Ethereum-based protocol for identity management. But Uport can't migrate onto any other blockchain but Ethereum. So if we end up in a situation of many blockchains of many underlying DNAs, then how do you make sure that these second, third, fourth layer protocols are generic enough that they can actually coexist on top of more than one blockchain? And that's what we see as being missing in the conversation. about, what does this decentralized internet need to look like in the future. So that's where we started saying, well, in our design, we need to make sure that, for one, we're generically able to support other networks. So, starting at the bottom here, we're talking about the fact that multiple blockchain protocols are going to exist, and a communication layer that sits between them needs to be able to understand these protocols, witness transactions on these networks, validate the authenticity of these networks, such that we can pull data off of an Ethereum-style blockchain and prove that it happened on Bitcoin blockchain, for example. And there's obviously other examples of that. So that was a big part of our design. Scale is a kind of a challenge in two senses. One, any single blockchain today has massive challenges around scale, and that's kind of inherent in the nature of decentralized systems. The most efficient way to build a system is to centralize it. But then you're kind of always making this trade-off between decentralization and efficiency for the most part, which leads you to, have any of you heard of CryptoKitties? Does anybody own a CryptoKitty in the room? No? How much did you guys pay for your CryptoKitties? Okay, you breeded them. Okay, I mean, there's some CryptoKitties that sold for up to $100,000. So, I mean, it's kind of a wild market. But if you don't know what CryptoKitty is, it's kind of a goofy example that illustrates challenges of the industry. CryptoKitties was this really it's still an operating system, kind of a cool, gimmicky application where you could breed and trade cats, digital cats on the Ethereum blockchain. Kind of Tamagotchi style, if you remember Tamagotchis in your pocket 20 years ago. The challenge is that one application brought the Ethereum blockchain to its knees. That one application's transaction throughput crushed the ability of that network to perform other people's transactions. So if you were running a fundraising ICO during the time of the CryptoKitties, or if you were trying to process transactions just for payment at that time, your transactions were likely stuck in a 2 or 3 day delayed transaction, mempool waiting to get processed by the network. So these scaling challenges are massively real. And there's two ways of solving them. One is thinking about how do you scale on top of a single blockchain? How do you build better performing virtual machines and execution environments so that you can do more throughput on your transactions? But also, how do you leverage multiple networks for scale? So what's been inefficient or impossible today is I can't take, let's say I have an application that requires millions of transactions per second. Right now, the designs that exist out there is that you have to build it on a single blockchain. But what if I could take those millions of transactions per second and fragment them onto many blockchains? And then simply re-aggregate the final state of all of those transactions so that we all know the truth at the end of all the transactions, but we've been able to kind of offload some of that throughput requirement onto multiple networks. So that's kind of the two angles of scale that we're working on, both using interoperability and also looking at improving the virtual machine design for execution of transactions. And then private and public really comes down to the fact that we know, even in the context of TCP/IP and internet protocols, private networks will always be relevant. Large companies still to this day use intranets for, employee communication and for, confidential information that shouldn't leave the barriers of the company. We think that will continue to be true. We think at a company level, at an industry level, at a geography level, there's going to be needs for networks that have restrictions, and then there's going to be need for networks that have no restrictions. And some of these networks are going to be governed by regulatory oversight, and some are going to be completely public, like Bitcoin. But, a system that allows for both to coexist is going to be critically important. So building a system that actually allows you to either deploy a network in its private state or a network in its public state is kind of part of the design that we're working on as well. So I'll skip through this because it just says more of the same. So quickly, without diving into this, there's kind of three major functionalities: federate, scale, and spoke. Very quickly, when we say federate, we mean how do you allow a transaction to move across multiple blockchains without it seeming like it's doing anything different to the user. Scale means how do you take an application's logic and move it from one blockchain to multiple blockchains. So can I run logic on multiple networks and still house it in a single application and ensure that that application is not centralized? The centralized applications are vulnerable to attacks. And spokes is the idea that if you run out of scale on a single blockchain, can you spin off new spoke blockchains that are kind of attached to the hub to take off some of that scaling requirement, take off some of that throughput requirement. So that was kind of what we were intending to solve for when we started building it. With that in mind, quick snapshot of the network ecosystem and the architecture. We sometimes diagram this as like a kind of an upside down tree, but in reality, there's kind of three pieces that we focus on in our design. One is Aion as a standalone public network. So we're building a public blockchain that's currently in test mode. It'll be released sometime in Q2 as kind of an operating public network. All right.
Just Telegram.
Telegram. All right, cool. So then inside this network, you can do a couple of things. We've got a couple of analogies that we use. A lot of people talk about interoperability protocols similar to TCP/IP in the internet. So just the communication mechanism to relay messages between endpoints on a network, which is absolutely a function here. But in addition to that, we also have kind of an operating system built on top of that protocol, meaning you can actually build decentralized applications at the intersection of blockchains so that an application can be built that says, if this happens on blockchain number 1, then I want you to trigger this on blockchain number 2, and make sure that all that logic is still decentralized and that the smart contracts that execute that logic are not vulnerable to, like, the man in the middle process. Secondly, this system kind of acts as a router. So one of the thought exercises we went through over a year ago, the first time we had a client ask us about, hey, can my blockchain talk to that blockchain? We went through this design exercise of what does it look like for one blockchain to talk to one blockchain? Can you build a bridge between two blockchains? It actually is a relatively solvable problem that a lot of people have found novel solutions to. But the challenge is that was kind of a one-to-one connection relationship, meaning if I was a blockchain in a network of one other, then I was only needed one blockchain, one connection. But if I'm a blockchain in a network of 1,000 other blockchains, and I need to build 999 connections to every single one of these blockchains. So how we solved that in traditional kind of communication protocols is we built routers. We said, well, as long as I'm aware of the router and everybody else is aware of the router, then the router takes care of relaying messages to anybody who's connected to it. So we've kind of applied that same design concept in the blockchain. So the network here operates not only as an operating system and a relay mechanism, but essentially operates as a router. So long as I'm aware of the router as a blockchain, and the blockchain I'm trying to send a transaction to is also aware of the router, then the router takes care of relaying the message. I don't have to know the destination source. The router takes care of that function for me, the transaction author. So that's kind of the core functions of this Aion blockchain. Kind of one layer above that, and they're a little bit faded out, is these bridges, these connections between blockchains. So the actual mechanism to move messages between two networks, for example. What was critical in this design is that it remained decentralized, and that it remained decentralized with the financial incentive for third parties to operate these bridges. Meaning we want a group of servers, random servers on the internet, to pick up and build a bridge that connects Ethereum to Aion, and make sure that they're not, incentivized to lie about the state of transaction crossing that bridge. So we essentially create a micro decentralized network, this bridge protocol, where a group of nodes can witness transactions on Ethereum, as an example, pull that transaction into the bridge, make sure every other node on the bridge agrees with the transaction, and then relay that message over to the Aion network, and then they would move on to the next bridge into the next network, for example. And then for that function, earn a reward that kind of ties them to the authenticity of the transactions going through that network. And make sure that they stake financial deposit into that bridge to make sure that if they're acting maliciously, they actually have something to lose. They have a financial disincentive to act maliciously. And then the three types of networks that we envision actually being able to connect into these routers is either existing public networks or future public networks. So Ethereum's an obvious candidate, or any Ethereum style network like Ethereum Classic or others. Bitcoin, newer networks like Cardano, EOS, whatever the case might be. So all these public network infrastructures that are getting built. Private networks like the ones I mentioned earlier. And finally, Aion spoke networks, which are essentially just DNA copies or duplications of the Aion network's kind of code base to rerun as a new network in parallel to it. So we can use this as kind of a design to kind of infinitely scale the number of networks. And what you'll notice as we try to illustrate here is that you can actually use a level 2 network to become a hub to a level 3 network. And you can kind of have this kind of spiderweb effect where networks can act as relays to each other and as routers to each other. And then you can send messages through them. So that's what we envision as kind of the long-term architecture of this. Do you want to jump in here, Sam, and talk about this before we get into the roadmap?
Yeah, sure.
Cool. So Sam's going to come up. Just quick context on Sam. Sam runs a lot of our kind of research and strategy for Aion, and he's probably better positioned to talk about this than I am.
Thanks. So these are kind of like 5 of the main kind of personas we've come up with for the users of Aion. As we go through like our research and constantly, we've kind of come up with more personas. So we'll probably update this in the next couple meetups. But there's 5 kind of core people that would interact with the Aion network. So the first one is the startup. So more and more as we've been kind of building out the Aion network, we're finding that a lot of companies, and a lot of them are newer companies, are interested in what does it mean to build their business on a decentralized infrastructure. And they start to see, well, if I'm going to build on a decentralized infrastructure, I'm going to need the ability to interoperate with other decentralized infrastructures. So they've started to see Aion as a place where they could build their technology and build their business. So these could be current companies that are building on other blockchains, or these are companies that are about to jump into the blockchain space. So we've had a lot of discussions there, and that's kind of one of the key actors that we see building on Aion. The other is the enterprise. So from a similar background, this is probably a business that more established is looking at, okay, how do I use maybe a private or a public network in my line of business? And that's where Matt talked about spoke networks, is we can kind of create this hybrid infrastructure where you can have a private network with some of maybe your more confidential data and interactions, and then also have a public network where maybe it's more transparent information that can be traded. So there's a hybrid approach there. So that's a big user group as well. Lastly, on the kind of top line, we have the dApp developers. So we see this as current dApp developers in the blockchain ecosystem. So these are most likely Solidity developers that are currently building in Ethereum. And I'll go in kind of into this in our roadmap, but there's some immediate benefits to building on Aion in terms of its execution and some of the cost implications. So we see Aion as a really interesting place for dApp developers to start building these cross-blockchain dApps. So the ability to build an application on Aion that can start to pull logic from different blockchains, whether that's a private or a public blockchain. So removing this barrier of all logic and all data from my dApp has to exist within the network that I build upon. Instead, I could build an application on Aion that could pull logic from Ethereum, it could pull logic from Cardano, Neo, and really expand the overall user group and market share of that application. And then lastly, this is more kind of infrastructure actors. So we have the validator and the bridge builder. The validator, I'll speak to it in consensus as well. So traditionally, this is seen as a miner. So today, in most proof of work systems, you have miners. And this in our, we have different validators and different releases, but for the first release, this is your traditional miner in a proof of work environment. And going forward, that'll come up into more of a staking mechanism and a solving mechanism. And the last piece is the bridge builder. So these are those bridges that Matt explained where you're able to have a common set of nodes that witness transactions and data changes between two different networks. They'll be operators of these bridges. So these could be mainstream organizations, they could be small individuals that want to run a node and want to kind of create a bridge and operate that bridge and monetize it based on the economy they want to create. So we're going to see with this bridge design a free market that starts to be created where people can spin up a bridge because they see value between two different networks. They say, okay, well, there's a lot of cool value that's in maybe Cardano, there's a lot of cool value that's in Ethereum. What if we could start to monetize a bridge between these two things? And maybe that'll be 10 people that want to operate that bridge, or there'll be 10 different bridges. So there'll be kind of a free market where people create bridges based on the incentive structure that they think rewards them, but then also adds to decentralization or potential features. So I think that's going to be a really interesting piece. So these kind of 5 actors summarize initially what we think we'll see as a lot of the building blocks for the Aion network. I'm going to skip through these because I kind of covered them. Example use cases. Yeah, so I know Matt talked about this today in his talk, but these are some of the 4 initial use cases that we see for Aion. The first one is really a decentralized exchange, and the reason here is around that cross-blockchain dApp functionality. So if I could create a decentralized exchange like EtherDelta that currently exists in Ethereum, if I could bring that over into an Aion context, now the decentralized exchange that I operate isn't just confined to the tokens in the Ethereum ecosystem. It could be expanded to all tokens or coins that connect to that infrastructure. So if there are bridges to 4 major blockchains, you could have a decentralized exchange that automatically swaps those native tokens of these other exchanges. So really starting to focus on that decentralized piece. Hybrid and public and private blockchains, I think we've talked about that quite a bit. Scaling solutions for public networks. So this is an interesting one. Right now, there's a lot of discussions about like layer 1, layer 2, and layer 3 scaling solutions for public networks. So these could be like an on-chain scaling solution, an off-chain scaling solution, and then kind of the layer 3 around interoperability and offloading data onto different networks. So where Aion's kind of positioned is to start to act at that layer 3 solution. So if you're a public blockchain that is having a lot of throughput requirements, like CryptoKitties, like Matt mentioned, well, you can start to take some of those transactions and move that off-chain into maybe a private network or a different spoke network, and then just submit the final state back. So we see it also as an immediate scaling solution for some of these large public networks. Roadmap. Yeah, so I'm going to start off talking about our testnet. So we recently launched our kind of beta testnet a few weeks ago. It's alive and active. And I think what I'll do to kind of visualize it is, I don't know if if you want to just click escape and then shift tab. Yeah, so if you guys can see this. So this is our dashboard. This went live a few weeks ago, or actually just last week. And this is if you guys are familiar with like Etherscan, this is a similar visualization of what's happening in the testnet. So this is, I guess we're just reloading it. This is a cool snapshot in terms of the current operations of the testnet. And when our mainnet launches, this will just point directly to the mainnet and the testnet. So you can see here we have a couple KPIs on the top in terms of the activity in the blockchain. So we have our target block times, current block times, hash rate, the average difficulty, and the block reward. So these are kind of generic network health metrics that are really important to know. And then as a user, if you've ever kind of sent transactions on a blockchain before, we have that ability to drill into transactions and drill into accounts. So even in our test network, if you're interested, you could download a node, start moving transactions, and then use this dashboard to kind of see the output, see what happened instead of doing it all through command line. So Matt's kind of showing, I think this is a block. So these are some of the, like for some of you, this might be obvious information, but these are some of the block data pieces that you can look through. So I suggest everyone can just go onto dashboard.aion.network and you can kind of play around with this. If you're more technically inclined on our testnet, I suggest you go into our GitHub. You can download the binary. The requirements, there's a few, but the main one is running Ubuntu. So if you can just install Ubuntu, I think it's 16.4, you can start playing around with the testnet, mining, doing transactions, and we'll be launching some pretty cool bounty programs in the next couple of weeks to kind of incentivize that pickup. I'm going to stop there and just maybe ask if anyone has questions on our testnet, because we're going to start going into some deeper components of the architecture. I think it might be good to make sure we're all kind of on the same page. Yeah.
It's not about testnet. Sure. What you talked about before about the routing and the interoperability between blockchains.
Yeah.
I kind of, have experience with the network side.
Yeah.
So, TCP, there's a protocol, there's a standard for interoperability between manufacturers and all stuff. Do you see that within the blockchain space, or do you see that coming as far as standards, as far as communicating between blockchains?
Yeah, I think so we a few months ago we launched something called the the Interoperability Alliance. So this was ourselves, WenChain, and Aion, so two other projects that are really into the interoperability space. And that was one of the main reasons we came together. Is we're saying we're all focusing on this idea of cross-chain transactions and coming up with a standard to make sure that whatever we build at the end of the day can be compatible with what they built. So if we create a bridge between WenChain and Aion, well, let's make sure that that bridge design is also compatible with their design. So that was the point of that alliance. And I think going forward, what's been really interesting is there's been a few other kind of cross-chain atomic swaps or other bridge designs that are starting to come out. And as our bridge design comes out and as all that code gets public, I think there'll be more and more kind of incentive for everyone to come together and say, okay, is this matching up? And is there starting to be like a common framework for how these bridges are designed? But we're still really early in terms of these designs. So there's already like 6 or 7 different designs for how you could move these transactions across, and each one has different trade-offs and different kind of assets.
Is there any type of organization that's maybe trying to oversee this?
I think that's kind of the purpose of the alliance as well. And as we grow that, we'll increase the membership to bring in more people that are focused on this interoperability piece. Yeah. Anything else maybe in general, but on the testnet or anything like that? It was super clear for everyone. Everyone's going to go download the binary. Yeah. Okay, cool. I'll look for all of you guys later. It's actually really easy. Like, I think I don't have a technical background, and I think that was like a big learning experience for myself. Is we have pretty good documentation on GitHub, and if you want to just get adventurous, take a read and just give it a shot. Like, it'll be really fun. If you're interested at all, just give it a go, and I think it's really fun to just participate in something that you're,
This is compared to other similar solutions.
Yeah, good question. So
maybe Cocoa framework.
Sorry, which framework?
Cocoa.
Not familiar with Cocoa. But in the general interoperability space and kind of the blockchain industry, there's quite a few different players that are coming out, and each one so far most of them have a particular focus, and that could be an initial asset or an initial use case that they're building for. So that could be a financial asset, or that could be tokens, or maybe more of a security idea, and they're building it for that purpose. And